All right, well, good morning and welcome to everybody. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Solita Marcelli, Chief Investment Officer here in Americas, and I'm super excited to be here this morning with you to discuss a topic that I believe is quite relevant and timely, and I think probably you think so too because you're here, which is the U.S. China relationship and its impact on Latin America. So thank you very much for taking time out of your day to join us for this special event. As you know, the relationship between the U.S. and China has only gotten more contentious. In fact, President Joe Biden has used the term extreme competition to describe it. And when we, according to our analysis, we don't believe these tensions are likely to abate in the years ahead for a couple of reasons, right? Number one, we're seeing Beijing's increasing focus on self-sufficiency. We are seeing bipartisan support for hawkish China policy, and of course the fundamental difference between two countries regarding the issue of Taiwan. But interestingly, Latin American countries sit right in the middle of this great power struggle, which means both opportunities as well as risk for the countries in the region. Now, of course, this is a topic, this relationship is something we have studied extensively within the UBS Chief Investment Office, and we've often written about this. But we are also very lucky to have access to some of the leading experts around the world on this relationship who have been living and breathing the U.S. China issues pretty much for years. And I can't think of a better partner to debate this topic than our friends at the Wilson Center. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the work of Wilson Center, it is simply one of the best global think tanks on international affairs. They have been performing independent analysis out of Washington, D.C. for over 55 years. And here at UBS, we have been building deep partnership with the Wilson Center over the years. In fact, I'm a proud member of Wilson Center's Global Advisory Council. My colleague here, Alejo, who runs our emerging markets research team out of New York, he is on the Wilson Center Latin American Program Advisory Board as well. So we're very excited that this partnership is yielding an event like this. We have some of the best and brightest minds, analysts from the Wilson Center in the room today. And so let me give you a bit of a sense of how we're going to sort of structure this conversation. So I'm going to start moderating a conversation with the Wilson Center's head of Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, Robert Daly, here on the future of the U.S. China relationship. And then after we're done, Alejo will be leading a conversation on the U.S., China, and Latin America relationship with our friends from the Wilson Center, Margaret Myers and Benjamin Gadin. So with that, without further ado, I want to invite Robert Daly over here. Thanks again for being here. Thank you for coming. Please, however you like. All right, I'm going to do a quick introduction. Robert, as I mentioned, he is the head of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. I think you would be hard-pressed to find anyone who is more knowledgeable about this bilateral relationship than Robert. First of all, he served as a U.S. diplomat in Beijing. Right? He led China programs at Johns Hopkins, Syracuse, University of Maryland, and he even acted as a producer on the Chinese language version of Sesame Street, which qualifies you more than any of those, right? Great. So thank you very much again. So Robert, I want to start with on a positive note, if I may. It was a very tense 2022, but then now U.S. and China seem to be looking for a floor in this bilateral relationship in the near term and make sure that the competition doesn't necessarily veer into a conflict. I think the Xi-Biden summit back in November explicitly sought more bilateral exchange and dialogue. Trade between the two countries are quite robust. We're seeing increasing volumes. And of course, this ADR issue, American Depository Receipts, seems to be resolved, at least for the time being. So do you agree that we are seeing a slight improvement in the direction of travel in this relationship?
I will try to stay positive in my answer for as long as I possibly can in the spirit of your question. But first, thank you to UBS for your partnership with the Wilson Center. It means a lot, not only to the Latin American program, but to the entire operation. I did, in preparation for this, go back and read your last few notes on China since the opening was announced, and I think that you nailed it. The cautions that you put out, the way that you framed this question, this is a moment when there is at the very least a break from a rapid decline in U.S. China relations. And it is a very good time to strengthen partnerships that had been active before COVID and to look around at where China is actually going. But I think we need to be a little bit careful. There's a trend right now toward, if not irrational exuberance, a little bit of hopeful short-termerism. As you said, Xi Jinping and President Biden met last year in Bali, and they seemed to agree to at least tone down the rhetoric, to resuscitate some of the dialogues that had been cut off, especially after then Speaker Pelosi's very ill-informed, ill-advised trip to Taiwan. As you said, to try to slow things down. So that's a good thing. We're having dialogue again. But notice, if you go back and look at the Bali discussions, neither Xi Jinping nor Biden changed any of their perceptions of the other, their perceptions of global competition. None of them have changed their strategies, their basic beliefs. That didn't change. The Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, will be in Beijing on the 4th and 5th. And as you mentioned, America talks about a floor and guardrails to avoid conflict. That's not how China puts it. China doesn't like this talk of guardrails and floors. They've been very clear. And I had a conversation with the American National Security Council about this last week. China rejects that. They say, when you say you want to put a floor under this relationship and guardrails around it, what you, America, mean is you want what you're doing to China to be okay. You want to legitimize this extreme competition, what China sees as an attempt at containment or an attempt even at regime change. And we're not going to play that game. You know, the United States likes to say now that we can't change China. This sounds very enlightened. We can't change China, but we want to change the environment in which China operates. And some of my very smart Chinese friends at the Chinese embassy, their answer is, yes, you want to change the environment in which we operate by cutting off the oxygen we breathe. So China wants a timeout from tension to develop its economy and to try to recover from COVID and to look inward. The United States is looking to try to get some new dialogues going and some codes in place, things like red lines, in order to pursue vigorous competition, which is exactly what China wants a break from. So the dynamics that brought us here are still in place pre-COVID, and when they talk about this new meeting, even with the Blinken trip, they mean different things. So it's a better place than we were several months ago in terms of the atmospherics, but I think it's going to be a short-term phenomenon.
Yeah. So the reasons why they both want a break is quite different. You wish there would be a translator between the two.
Yes.
A translator of intentions, obviously. Okay, so I did attempt to start on a positive note, but of course I'm gonna, obviously move to the challenges, because then otherwise, what's the point of this conversation, right? So, as you said, the U.S. and China has been clashing in, a number of growing areas. Is it the trade war? Has now widened into a technology war. It has widened into a capital war. On October 8th, for instance, obviously we've seen the Biden administration release far-reaching semiconductor-related export controls. There is a debate in the U.S. Congress about implementing a mechanism to curb U.S. investments into China because of national security considerations, of course. What is, I guess, your take in terms of where we're headed in terms of the U.S.-China priorities, other than what you said, which is China wants to turn inward to develop, and the U.S. wants to figure out how it can be more competitive?
I'm about to say something very depressing, so I want to preface it by saying that I'm not a hawk. I've been an engager with China for over 30 years, to my great benefit, as you mentioned. Sesame Street, Chinese soap operas, plays, the whole bit. I've been all in. But you've already mentioned a trade war, a tech war, a capital war, and a situation in which the United States is trying to prevent extreme competition from becoming a hot war. We have a name for this, and it's Cold War. And that I think is where we are. This is going to be a long-term competition that is manifest all around the world at both poles in cyberspace and in outer space. It's going to be extremely costly, wasteful, and dangerous. That isn't to say that there are no opportunities therein. It's a Cold War, not the Cold War. And one of the things that's going to distinguish this Cold War from the previous one is the degree of integration that we have going into it. The way that our institutions are involved with each other, that we benefit from each other. There's still a lot of residual good feeling between American and Chinese institutions and people. The public opinion polling shows about 80% negative perceptions in China toward the United States and in the United States toward China. But there's still a lot of good feeling left there. So I think that it is going to be a Cold War because it touches on core interests, values of both countries. It will be played out primarily as a competition to shape a shifting world order. And if we can keep it cold, and we should be able to, it will primarily be played out in the economic and technological spaces. You mentioned the October 8th export controls that the United States put in place. That was a major move. If that's not a Cold War, evidence of a Cold War, I don't know what is. We said essentially to the Chinese people that we are going to openly hamper their ability to develop artificial intelligence and advanced computing because their government is such a threat that we don't want those new technologies to go into weapons that could target the United States. And I think that most Americans would support this rationale. We're not going to sell you the rope you use to hang us. Why should we? So that makes sense. But another way to think about it from a Chinese point of view is anytime you read an article about what AI or quantum or nano or synthetic biology promises, all of that, for education, for transportation, for agriculture, for medicine, the United States has said to China, not for you, not if we can help it. And so the strategic rationale for those export controls is by its nature absolutist and expansive. And anything that is seen as contributing in a major way to what China calls its comprehensive national power is going to be suspect in an American government that is extremely suspicious of China already. And I should emphasize, there's equal suspicion on the other side. I'm talking about what the United States has done. China is also pursuing decoupling for a different set of reasons. There were areas in which China never coupled for security reasons. There's equal suspicion there. But this is going to continue. So we're not going to see, if anyone here still thinks, after reading your excellent notes, which don't say this, that this spring is going to see an opening and a return to the status quo ante. That's not in the cards. I don't think this relationship has found bottom yet.
Okay. So even though, so you mentioned Cold War, and one of the things in the Cold War, I guess, was that the economies were not so interconnected, right? But here, even though they're going to keep on trying to become less interdependent, I guess the complete decoupling is going to be hard to reach, right? It seems almost impossible, I guess, with the right intentions and time, maybe. But for the time being,
I think that is a very safe assumption. Borrowing from Dan Rosen, who's at the Rhodium Group here, his description of decoupling is that it should be partial, peaceful, and provisional. I'm quoting him because I don't think there's been a better description of that, so it's worth looking at. But the scope that is covered by that is expanding, especially as AI starts to become genuinely valuable and useful to more and more industries. We're going at that. We're going at semiconductors. We're going at the software, at the machine tools. The Biden administration has already said that things like CRISPR-style technologies, emergent biotech is something else that has to be included in that. So yes, decoupling will be partial, but those partial areas are going to be expanding, especially as new technologies come on board. One of the big questions as we enter into this new Cold War is precisely what major multinational corporations in the financial sector, the decisions that you make and the decisions that allies make. Most developed countries, certainly in Europe and Northeast Asia, share the United States' growing concerns about China and the security front. They share those concerns. But they're not quite the same as those of the United States. They share our concerns minus the United States' desire to maintain international preeminence. That's a big one. Minus specific interests in the Asia-Pacific region, and plus a much stronger desire, particularly in the Latin American region, to benefit from trade and investment with China. So how that plays out and how much China is either able to find substitutes for America's involvement or to peel off allies, industries, and corporations, that's likely to be, I think, the key question in the competition going forward.
Okay. So you, in the first question I asked, you talked about short-term exuberance or short-termism.
Yeah.
I took a hopeful short-termism. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's see what it can maybe break this in the near term. So obviously the Republicans took over the House. Could this lead to maybe a more hawkish China policy coming out of Washington in the next few months? And also, do you think a visit to Taiwan by the new congressional leadership is likely this year? And how would China respond this time around?
So we will certainly see an even more hawkish policy coming out of Washington. The Republicans are more hawkish rhetorically, but it's actually a bipartisan agreement. It's not really a partisan issue other than style. We have this new select committee in the House, which will be led by Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin, and that's a committee of committees, which is looking at all of the China-related work that the other committees are involved in. And over the past several years, there have been some 500 proposed pieces of legislation aimed at somehow limiting or countering China. And so their job is to try to accentuate those and to pick winners and losers. But it's not just Congress. Certainly the Department of Defense, there is really only one China narrative, and that's that China is our pacing threat. And part of that narrative is also that we may have to fight in the Taiwan Straits sometime in the next 4 to 10 years. I'm in a minority that's a little bit more optimistic on that. I don't think that Xi Jinping is champing at the bit. But the odds, the chances of a catastrophic collapse in relations have gone up. And there are equal pressures on the Chinese side. There are Chinese hawks as well. The Chinese military is as America-focused and hawkish as is the U.S. military. So we need to look at that side as well. And then Kevin McCarthy, the new leader, has said that he will go to Taiwan. I think that China has enough understanding to know that because he's from a different party, it's slightly different than the Pelosi visit, although China has seen Pelosi as an enemy since shortly after Tiananmen Square, when she went to Tiananmen Square and unfurled a banner supporting the protesters there. But China still has to respond. Nationalism in China is very strong. So there will be a strong response to a McCarthy visit. And what's really worrisome about that is that China has to respond to McCarthy from the advanced position it established after it responded to Pelosi. This is why these trips are so ill-advised. Every time someone goes, China sort of pushes a pawn. Their warships, their planes come closer, their missiles come closer. And these visits, for the most part, I'm not saying that we should never go, don't do much for Taiwan itself. It actually increases the peril for the people of Taiwan. But American leaders, feel that they've shown the flag, and then they tend to make broad statements, as Speaker Pelosi did. We stand with you. What does this mean? I don't think it means very much at all. America.
Do you send soldiers? Probably not.
It means that we approve of you, we admire you, we don't like the mainland. But does it mean that Does it mean that Americans are going to fight and die for Taiwan in large numbers? There's no commitment to that, and so I think it would be helpful if we could, in the spirit of Bali, still counter China when we must, but try to tamp down the unnecessary, do it because it makes you feel good, provocations of China for provocation's sake. We need to find some space there.
Great. So Robert, we want to get a little bit of scoop from Washington, D.C. We know obviously that there's changes to China's diplomatic representation in Washington. It's taking place right now. Can you help us understand what are these changes and what does that really mean for this relationship?
Well, the Chinese ambassador for the past year and a half, almost 2 years, Qin Gang, has now left Washington after, in many ways, an unsatisfactory stint from his point of view. He did not get many meetings in Washington itself. He was not very well received there. He was seen in Washington as being something of a lightweight as well as something of a wolf warrior. And he had a very hard act to follow. The previous ambassador, who'd been there for a long time, was quite highly regarded. And so he didn't get the meetings he wanted in Washington. And now he's the foreign minister. So it appears that Washington might have somewhat misperceived his role in the hierarchy, or at least how close he is to Xi Jinping. So one question is, Qin Gang as foreign minister, is he nursing a grievance? Now, the foreign minister of China doesn't make China's foreign policy. The foreign minister isn't even the most powerful Chinese leader in setting foreign policy generally. But we have a new ambassador, is probably going to be Xie Feng, who knows Washington very well, widely known throughout the bureaucracies, has a little bit of the wolf warrior in him as well, by which I mean that the wolf warriors sometimes lead with their fists. The previous Chinese ambassador, Cui Tiankai, was a terrific counterpuncher. He always fought his corner and defended China's interests. He just didn't throw the first punch. But he was always ready if it came to that. So Xie Feng has had some of that in his background, but he also is far more experienced than his predecessor. And I suspect that people in Washington who closed out Qin Gang will be open, at least initially, to having meetings with Ambassador Xie. But those meetings are not what determine either the tone or the direction of U.S. China relations. It's really the big moves that are being made, a la a Cold War. Yeah. Both countries want to be the primary shaper of security architectures, trade and investment regimes, technology, developing it, marketizing it, regulating it, and they want to be the greatest influence on global norms and practices and the values that underlie them. That's the big game that is going to continue to push this relationship towards contentious diplomacy. We should be able to avoid a hot war, but the pressures keep increasing, and there are a certain number of unknowns, known unknowns, that neither Washington or Beijing can control. And I'm thinking here about Ukraine, primarily among them, what Taiwan does. The death of the Dalai Lama, not a black swan, something that's coming up quickly and that is going to put another spotlight on human rights questions in China, as well as domestic politics. These are issues that we know are coming, and again, that neither Xi nor Biden can control.
Okay. Switching over to an area maybe of potential collaboration between the two countries, environmental sustainability has been one of those areas that has that potential. Have we seen progress in the real sense on that front?
We've seen a resuscitation of talks, which is extremely important. John Kerry and his Chinese counterpart are now able to speak again. The Chinese side had cut off those discussions after the Pelosi visit. We're now having some more discussions. But you asked whether they're real and make a difference. People usually say, oh, well, we must cooperate on climate change. And of course, that's true, but we're not really speaking about cooperation so much as we are parallel action, coordinated parallel action. Only we can lower our emissions and only they can lower theirs, which they're doing for their own reasons. When we speak of cooperation, we really mean big public events at which American and Chinese leaders pledge together to do certain things in order to rally other countries to do likewise. But it's not cooperation of the sort that we had before the Trump administration with our CDCs, where we were involved in each other's government machinery. The Chinese CDC had people in the United States offices, and we had people in China. And they were changing practices and sharing information. This was all post-SARS. And that's the kind of really constructive cooperation that we need, and we could have, for example, in making global food supply chains, safer and greener. What we really need to see is cooperation that involves real involvement and the co-provision, co-investment and co-provision of global public goods. That will be the sign that this competition has a mature cooperative aspect. The climate change piece, say, is largely important packaging, but packaging. It's parallel action. What we really need is co-involvement in providing public goods.
Okay. Thank you. So I just want to be mindful of time. I know we have quite a bit of our journalists and our clients here. I would like to start taking questions from the audience, if you have any.
So there's been a recurring argument that the trade relationship between the United States and China was something that made a traditional Cold War less likely, unlike the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, because bilateral trade there was very small. As we decouple, is it more likely that the odds of a hot war rise just as we decouple because the trade becomes less important? And the second part of the question is the era of strategic ambiguity over?
So I don't think that trade is any longer, the way Xi Jinping has put it, is that it's been the ballast in the relationship. It's the thing that steadies the ship. And it still is to some degree. One of the strongest arguments against saying that's a Cold War is precisely what you point to. If you actually look at the trade volumes, despite decoupling, if you look at the interest of capital this spring and perhaps going back into China, although there's some hesitancy there and the headlines change really day by day, I think that remains a positive in the relationship, but it's not the ballast. I spend a lot of time with multinational corporations, with technological corporations, and with universities. And the financial companies and other companies, they all want the logic of the market or the logic of economic efficiency, which is sufficient unto itself to carry the day. And the technologists feel the same way about Moore's Law and the path of innovation. And the universities feel the same way about how we have to have openness and internationalization of universities for the generation of human knowledge. But under certain circumstances, the security prerogatives come in and say, mine. I've got this now. My logic supersedes all of your logics. And we are midway toward that happening. We don't know whether it's going to continue to go forward or not. But as I said, the odds of a catastrophic collapse because of, say, something happening in Taiwan, which, like Russia in Ukraine, decimates this argument at a stroke. The odds of that, while I think still not above, I'm just pulling this number out of the air, I don't know, 20%, they're non-trivial. So I think that there's a far more need for everybody to be doing constant political risk assessment of a very different nature. Is strategic ambiguity over? Do you all know what he means by this? Strategic ambiguity, the United States has never said that it would or would not defend Taiwan. Because if you say you will defend Taiwan, you embolden Taiwan to declare independence, and you're in war with China. If you say you won't, you embolden China to invade, and you don't want that either. Is strategic ambiguity? There's a little shred of strategic ambiguity left. The Biden administration says repeatedly the one China policy has not changed. The one China policy has changed. We're speaking of the one China policy as though there is not anything to it and never has been anything to it other than the mere technical fact that we recognize Beijing and not Taipei as the leader of China. And that's true, and that's going to remain true. But there's been a lot more to the one China policy than that. And one of the most important pieces that has changed is that the United States, under the one China policy, has always said that we don't have a position as to the final resolution of these tensions. In other words, as long as they're solved peacefully and in accordance with the desires of the people of Taiwan. We used to say the desires of people on both sides of the strait. Now we say the people of Taiwan. But so the meaning of this was under the one China policy that actually it was okay with the United States if Taiwan became part of China, as long as it was done peacefully. But now we've begun to speak of Taiwan as a strategic asset of the United States. That's a real change in the one China policy. We have also become far less assiduous about referring to Taiwan as a nation, about these aspects of treating Taiwan as a non-country, which sometimes got ridiculous. People used to say this is angels dancing on the head of a pin or something like that. But I can tell you that when I joined the Foreign Service in 1986, the catechism, if I could use a Catholic grammar school analogy, the catechism of the one China policy was socialized throughout the State Department, such that if a diplomat, even within the State Department, referred to China as a country, there were nuns in the State Department who would come and slap the back of your hand with a ruler. That's no longer true. Now, it's also true that, so the one China policy has changed on our side. It's also true that China has become far more threatening and far more aggressive. And it's also very true that the situation has changed since 1972. When we completed the Shanghai Communique, America said, and this was very important to China, that we acknowledged that people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait say that there is only one China and Taiwan is part of it. That's a central pillar, the one China policy. But that's simply not untrue now. There is too much water under the bridge. It's unsustainable to claim that the people of Taiwan want to return to the embrace of the motherland. It's not true, and we won't say it. So yes, we've toyed with strategic ambiguity. We've definitely shifted what we mean by the one China policy. But conditions have now changed so broadly that I think that we can't simply look at, as Beijing would like to, the three communiques and the promises made in '72 as a workable foundation for managing cross-straits relations.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. How can you comment a little on how the relatively recently announced proximity between China and Russia further complicates, I guess, all the dynamics that you've just explained? And then second, can you comment on what the perception is now in China after this dramatic U-turn as it relates to their COVID policy is? How are the people reacting? Is this backfiring on the Communist Party? Just your thoughts on that.
These are all very important questions that could have book-length answers. I'll try to keep it short, which means I'll be a little bit pat, so I'm sorry about that. Clearly, Xi Jinping last year standing with Vladimir Putin February 4th and saying that this was a no-limits partnership. This was one of the greatest mistakes of his leadership, and it was one that he made very publicly. Horrible judgment many times over on his part. China is claiming neutrality. It is not neutral. It is putting a thumb on the scale on Russia's side, and there are numerous pieces of evidence for that. It doesn't mean China wanted this invasion. This is in no way in China's interest, and China had very good relations with Ukraine and would like to continue to have good relations with Ukraine. But they have made a decision because they feel under threat, a true existential threat from the United States and the West. Again, they believe our policy, no matter what we say, is regime change and containment. Therefore, they need powerful friends. So they have thrown all in with Russia, and this has hurt China reputationally, especially in Europe. China in 2023 is going to be trying to carry out smile diplomacy toward Europe, trying to resurrect negotiations on the comprehensive agreement on investment. But Europe is a lot more skeptical of China because of this. And the other thing that's been very bad for China is that the invasion of Ukraine has increased global attention to China's intentions vis-a-vis Taiwan. This analogy, China is to Taiwan as Russia is to Ukraine, that analogy doesn't work for Beijing. They don't like it, but it's accepted internationally. So this is not working for them. How are the people of China responding? I haven't been in China for 3 years now because of COVID, and I hesitate. I've lost my China street sense. I've lost my mojo. I read the same articles you do, and so I'm hesitant to comment on that. I think that if you see, a stronger economic performance, especially in the second and third quarters, then a lot of the dissatisfactions which led to the weekend of protests will probably be forgotten, and they will move on. Those protests were misreported in the West. Some journalists referred to it as the White Paper movement or revolution. It was neither a movement nor a revolution. It was really a weekend. And it was reported that when people in China said, we don't want COVID tests, we want freedom, this was reported in the United States as if it meant that they want to enact the Bill of Rights in Beijing. What they really meant was we want freedoms of movement, freedom of association, freedom to see our friends and our family and eat in restaurants like we did before COVID. That's what they meant. And they may well get that freedom back.
Thank you. How much of the deterioration in the U.S.-China relationship is due to Xi Jinping being the president? If we have a different leader in China, would you envision a different path, or is this Xi Jinping just to accelerate what's inevitable? My second question is, Have you in contact with any of the new leadership that the elected to the through the 20th Party Congress? And there's impression in the investment community that Xi Jinping installed all these lawyers to the leadership. So the odds for a big mistake it has increased. Has markets misunderstood what's going on there, in your opinion?
So it is true that Xi Jinping seems to be leader for life, and that he put only loyalists and people who've worked with him on the standing committee of the Politburo. Here again, I think there's been a little bit of misreporting in the West. It's true that all of these people are loyalists to Xi, and it may well be true that this is going to put him in an even smaller echo chamber where he doesn't get accurate reporting about some of the effects of his policies. But the implication in the Western media has sometimes been that all of these loyalists who won't challenge Xi are, because they're supposedly yes men, that they're also dupes and fools. That latter part isn't really right. The fact that they're loyalists doesn't mean that they don't have any merits and they don't know anything, or that they're incompetents. I think we need to push back a little bit on that narrative. Your question about how much of this is Shiism. Shiism plays a role. I mean, obviously, U.S. China friction, what I'm saying is now a Cold War. I think in the main that these are historical structural forces which were unavoidable. They were going to appear in some form anyway because of China's rise, which is faster and larger and more consequential than any other rise in history. And if we take Xi Jinping out of it, if we take Marxism, Leninism, Maoism out of it, you can still make an argument that what China wants as it's become powerful are the same thing every other country wants as it becomes powerful. For at least the next 5 minutes, it's still the world's most populous nation. It's extremely wealthy. It wants to translate wealth into power, as any country would. It's an ancient civilization state and is the economic lodestone of the most economically dynamic region on Earth. Any country in that position wants to secure its interests. It wants to shape the global environment as much as it can to be amenable to its desires, and it wants to push its defensive perimeter outward. That's all natural. The question then becomes, but what are China's interests? How does it want to change the global order? And that the answer clearly is it wants to make it less liberal. Not that it's perfectly liberal. I don't think that the United States government should say we want to defend the international rules-based order. I think that's the wrong line. It should be that we want to work with stakeholders around the world to improve an order that works for everybody, although we want that to be more liberal. China is trying to legitimize internationally the illiberal practices of governance that it uses domestically. And that's going to be a fight. The answer of developed democracies is hell no. The question other countries have to ask themselves is, do we want to live in our own nations as the Chinese people live in theirs? Do we want to be treated that way internationally? And I think the answer is no. So this is going to be a long-term fight. Some of that is Xi. Xi represents the nationalist, Maoist, princeling, aggressive strand in China, but there are other strands. There are reformist, liberalist, international strands. I don't think, as many in Washington say now, that engagement was a mistake because we've raised a tiger. The people who say that engagement was a mistake are historical determinists. They're saying that the emergence of Xi Jinping in his current form was always foreseeable, with the convenient caveat that they didn't foresee it. It wasn't foreseeable. It wasn't written. There are other potential leaders in China who are still proud Chinese patriots, who are nevertheless reformists and internationalists. So yes, Xi and the nature of his leadership plays a role, but I think that most of this is a structural and historical issue.
Well, thank you so much for your questions, for your engagement. It's always a treat to hear from you, Robert. Really appreciate it. I want to make sure we have more than enough time to get through our next panel, which I know is going to be a continuation and probably more focus on Latin American impact as well. With that, thank you, and the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you again for coming. I personally thought that was a terrific panel. I learned a lot. Could have listened to Robert and Solita for the whole morning. For those of you who don't know me, Alejo Cherwonko. I run the emerging markets team here out of New York City for UBS Global Wealth Management. We invest in developing countries' currencies, equities, and bonds. I'm also a professor at Columbia University, where I teach a course about the evolution of capital markets in emerging markets over the last 4 decades, the periods of booms and busts that we've all experienced in these countries. But maybe most importantly for today, I've been engaged with the Wilson Center for 3 years through their Latin America program. I'm a member of their advisory board, which has been a most rewarding experience. What we want to do today is try to understand where Latin America falls within this great power struggle between the U.S. and China. There are areas of great opportunities, but also, of course, it is a much trickier land to travel, right, in the next few years. And I'm very excited to be accompanied today by, experts in the field, both from the Wilson Center, Margaret Myers, and Benjamin Gedan. I'm going to do a proper formal introduction, if you allow me. We've got Margaret to my immediate left. She's a fellow in the Latin America program of the Wilson Center. She's also a director of the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue. She's taught on these issues at Georgetown, GW, and Johns Hopkins. And she began her career as a Latin American China analyst for the U.S. Department of State. Thank you, Margaret, for being with us. Benjamin Gedan is also with us. He is the head today of the Latin America program at the Wilson Center. He also teaches at Johns Hopkins, where he got his PhD. And he started his career as a South America director on the National Security Council at the White House as well. So why don't we dive right in? I want to start with the basics. Maybe, Benjamin, if you can walk us through what the U.S. wants out of its relationship with Latin America and how has that evolved over the last few years?
Sure. Thank you so much for all of your service to the Wilson Center. It's been an incredible partnership, and we're delighted that we're deepening it and using this space and these partners to be able to address audiences in New York and elsewhere in these shared interests. So thank you. I think the United States, broadly speaking, sees a strategic necessity in having Latin America as a prosperous, stable, and democratic region, above all so that the United States can address numerous issues outside the Western Hemisphere. And I think there's a bipartisan consensus that has held for quite a while that should the United States not have to pay attention on a daily basis to the Americas, it opens up strategic resources, military resources, and the focus of the national security infrastructure to address global interests elsewhere, including in the Asia Pacific. Unfortunately, for the United States policymakers, none of those are the case today. So Latin America is now ending what is often referred to as a second lost decade, another period of very slow growth, ups and downs in many countries, but broadly speaking, economic stagnation with serious political consequences. The democracies in Latin America, which had been a great triumph of the second wave of democratization, have stumbled in recent years. There are now 3 consolidated dictatorships in Latin America and democratic recessions elsewhere in the region that are of concern to the United States. And then I think the consequences of both of those phenomena have challenged the United States in terms of migration. There's now unprecedented waves of migration, not only coming from historical sources such as Mexico and northern Central America, but from Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and elsewhere. So if the objective of the United States, broadly speaking, is to have a peaceful, quiet, prosperous, democratic region so that the United States can focus on other priorities, none of that is being achieved at the moment. And so I think it creates challenges that we've perhaps not faced in many years for those who manage U.S.-Latin American relations.
Very good. So then, Margaret, you're an expert in China-Latin America relationships. What is China looking for in terms of engaging with the region?
Well, I mean, frankly, it's my view, and I've been looking at this topic, you know, at the Inter-American Dialogue and now at the Wilson Center for far over a decade, that China's interests in Latin America and indeed globally are very closely linked to China's own economic objectives at home. You know, back when China first engaged with the Latin American and Caribbean region in the mid-1990s, early 2000s, the primary objectives were, you know, to expand export markets and then also to achieve food and energy security. And those, you know, those two considerations, those two objectives continue to underscore, to motivate a lot of what China is attempting to do in the Latin American region and beyond. That said, you know, China is now encountering a much more difficult economic situation than it was, you know, just a number of years ago. It's no longer going to be able to rely on property sales to, you know, to generate economic GDP growth, economic growth at the same rate that has in the past. And so we'll be looking, you know, to really rely on innovation, on tech sector development, to boost productivity and to continue to grow at higher rates as a result of that. And we have to understand, you know, that this is a major motivation for China, not only at home, but also in terms of shaping its outreach in the Latin American and Caribbean region and indeed across the globe. And so in Latin America and the Caribbean, this, you know, largely translates, in my view at least, to more in the way of engagement, not just in raw materials, right, as China continues to try to, you know, to achieve food and energy security, but also in, you know, wide-ranging sectors that, and especially those that encompass what China has termed as of a couple of years ago, new infrastructure, right? Meaning really innovation-related technologies that are intended to upgrade China's economy and indeed address this productivity issue. And so we are seeing that. We've been seeing that for 5 years, and my expectation is looking ahead, you know, we'll continue to see trade, obviously in those sectors that are of critical strategic interest to China, but also, you know, a continued focus and indeed more expansive focusing in these sectors that China perceives as directly linked to its own economic upgrading. So that's one motivation, linking, you know, to China's own domestic priorities, especially as concerns its own economic growth. There are also, of course, you know, wide-ranging diplomatic and political priorities at play. And China has invested heavily in promoting these, you know, its wide-ranging interests in these areas, largely through what it calls people-to-people connectivity, which is, you know, one of the sort of facets of the Belt and Road Initiative, connectivity, which is, you know, a connectivity-enhancing initiative, although we tend to consider it to be largely infrastructure-related. And by this I mean, you know, wide-ranging educational exchanges, trips, trainings for, you know, for journalists, for other civil society, for military, new platforms, diplomatic and otherwise, for cooperation and collaboration in a wide range of areas. One of the things that China is trying to achieve by means of these mechanisms is just to improve and ensure, you know, a positive image of China, to keep the door open for more in the way of economic and other engagement. But there are also, and this was, you know, mentioned in the previous discussion, you know, a number of other interests that China is looking to promote, and these include Taiwan, of course, you know, ensuring that there is a common view of China or a shared priority, a shared policy on Taiwan, and, you know, potentially also support for China in the event of some sort of cross-strait military contingency. And then in addition to that, you know, as Robert mentioned, China has, you know, wide-ranging interests, policy-related interests that it's looking to promote globally, whether as concerns internet governance or human rights or other issues. And so looking for, you know, a strong relationship and, you know, ideally alignment in views, or at least support for some of these objectives.
Thank you, Margaret. So now we got a initial understanding of what the U.S. wants to get out of Latin America, what China's objectives are in the region. How about what Latin America itself wants? We've seen quite a bit of political change coming out of the region in the last 2 years in what we've called an electoral super cycle. Have Latin American priorities vis-a-vis the U.S. and China changed? Maybe starting with China. Margaret, over to you.
It's a really great question. I mean, it's a question I think that those of us who are looking at China's engagement with Latin America are trying to understand is, how do China's priorities shift? How do Latin American priorities shift when we see important shifts in the political dynamic and the political landscape? And it's my, again, it's my view that they don't shift all that much. What we're seeing from Latin America, Latin American governments in general across the ideological spectrum is an interest in more in the way of economic engagement, more trade, more investment, right? Support, loans in certain situations. Some countries want loans, some countries do not. Chinese loans, others do not. And on the Chinese side, again, I mean, these same motivating factors, whether they're related to the going out strategy, right, of the 1990s, or to the Belt and Road Initiative, or any other wide-ranging facet of China's foreign policy, tend to be rather constant, right? China achieves more with some governments than others, right? But these motivations, these interests, stay more or less the same. I would say, though, on the Latin American side, there are countries, and especially those, that where, the erosion of democratic principles is most pronounced, that have looked to China really as a source of support at a moment when they are facing limitations, sanctions, restrictions from the U.S. and from other governments, and are operating in a much less permissive, economic environment. China has been accommodating. Here, I'm thinking of El Salvador, for example, or Venezuela is perhaps the best example of this, but only to a certain extent. Right, we've seen infusions of capital. We've seen support for Bukele's agenda in El Salvador. We've seen, a longer history of support in Venezuela. Upwards of 60 billion in loans or lines of credit issued to that country over the past 15 or so years. But a lot of there is a moment, at least in the case of Venezuela, right, when Chinese patience wears a bit thin, and where a determination is made that throwing good money after bad is probably not the best course of action. And indeed, China would appear to have reached that conclusion, having lent really nothing to Venezuela for, I believe it's for years now, despite some new investment and some other forms of engagement. I remember speaking, it was almost 6-7 years ago, to a member of a company that was operating, Chinese company that was operating in Venezuela, and asked him about what his perceptions were of China's engagement there and how Chinese companies were perceiving it. And he said, he used a Chinese idiom that was 无上最川, which means essentially, and this is a very liberal interpretation of what this means, but boarding a pirate ship, right, when maybe you thought you were going to board a yacht, right? So it's a sort of and that's again a loose interpretation, loose translation, but there was a sense that this was going to be a good venture, right, at the onset, would help China to achieve its objectives, especially as concerns energy security, but that turned out not to be the case.
I hope China doesn't feel the same about every single Latin American country at the moment.
Hopefully there's some yachts out there.
Terrific. Benjamin, so what do you think Latin America is looking to achieve out of its engagement with the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I largely see it the same way. I think there's an agnosticism when it comes to regime type, the way China views the region, and I think we've seen the same thing in recent elections in Brazil, when there was a conservative Jair Bolsonaro elected, in Argentina, when a conservative Mauricio Macri was elected. There was expectations of maybe a shift in economic engagement and diplomatic posture toward China that didn't materialize in either case. And I think the evidence is strong in those two important South American economies and elsewhere, that in Latin America there's bipartisan consensus that Chinese investment in infrastructure is needed, that Chinese market access is important for the commodity exporters from South America. Where I want to caveat it is I do think there is still a strain in Latin America that does view things in a more ideological perspective and sees China as balancing U.S. interest in the Americas. And I don't think that's an invention of U.S. hawks who are looking to attack China's presence. I do think that the passion for the BRICS, this Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa institution, the creation of CELAC, which is a hemispheric body that excludes Canada and the United States, which are of course members of the much older and well-established Organization of American States. These are all indications that within Latin America there is a school of thought in foreign policy circles that it's useful to bring in another actor to balance the influence and power of the United States and to give more leverage, particularly in great power competition, to the governments of the Americas. And so I do think we have to acknowledge that there is still some ideological component, at least from the perspective of Latin American governments at times, even if everyone is largely speaking welcoming of Chinese investment. The one other point that I would note is that China isn't the only country reconsidering the history of its engagement in Latin America. We saw Ecuador recently renegotiating its debts with China, and for years has had an internal debate as to whether that type of lending was fruitful, whether it was well used within Ecuador, and whether now the oil that has to be sold to China to repay that debt could be going for better development purposes. And so I do think as China enters a new phase of its engagement with less state lending and more debt repayment, there may be a reconsideration as well and a questioning, particularly when a different political party is in power, as to whether the relationship with China has been as effective as many had hoped. Those would be my two caveats, while acknowledging that I think overall there's a red carpet for China in almost all of the region.
Very good. Let's try to put it all together. We talked about U.S. priorities vis-a-vis the region, Chinese priorities with respect to Latin America, Latin American priorities itself. What are the areas of overlap, right? Where are the opportunities for Latin America? Where are the trickier parts to navigate for Latin America? Sticking with you, Benjamin.
Yeah, I think the United States policy toward China's role in Latin America has evolved over time. And I think the original approach still has some adherence in Washington, and is worth then acknowledging, despite what I think Robert correctly points out as a bipartisan consensus to see China as a danger in every part of the world. Originally, I think the view that the United States had was acknowledging the infrastructure gap in Latin America, its impacts on competitiveness in the Americas and also on U.S. interests in the region, and so saw Chinese engagement as potentially useful. Obviously, the Latin Americans themselves agreed, with a few important caveats about environmental protection, labor rights, and the potential for undermining democratic institutions. That had evolved under the Trump administration to pressure on Latin American governments for decoupling and for a full divorce between the regions, and it has evolved yet again to now a discussion of informal red lines, sectors that I think Margaret can discuss, where the U.S. sees particular dangers to U.S. national interests, while acknowledging why and the inevitability of further economic engagement in the region. I tell that evolution not only because I think it's an interesting story of how the broader U.S.-China relationship has played out in the Americas, but because I think that original framework still exists to some degree, which is to say I think that there is an acknowledgement that Chinese capital can be useful in Latin America, and that if put to good use, it's in the U.S. interest that it, again, promotes stable democratic institutions and an economy that functions, again, in the Western Hemisphere, reducing migration and creating opportunities for the United States. So what I would say is, I think grudgingly, there are parts of the U.S. policymaking community that still recognize that versions of Chinese economic engagement in Latin America are in the U.S. interest.
Thank you. Margaret, what do you think? Opportunities and risks, putting it all together.
Sure. So, as I mentioned before, right, I think we're really seeing, I tend to say we're seeing three things happening, right, in terms of Chinese engagement, and this is a bit of an aside, and I'll be very quick about it, but we see a sort of tapering, right, of overall economic engagement. Trade's still fundamental, still, underscoring the entire relationship, but a slight decrease, right, in investment, overall investment. Some of that related, obviously, to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then a real drop in lending in particular, which has really contributed to this overall tapering of economic engagement. At the same time, we're seeing a focusing, and again, it's on these sectors, right? These sectors, new infrastructure, innovation-related sectors that are very much linked to China's own economic growth, and which are very much welcomed, right, by a lot of countries in the Latin American region that are looking to make major advances in, for example, green energy, renewable energy, and other forms of innovation, including in the telecommunications realm. And then finally, a localization, right, of activity. So for many, many years, these deals were struck at the government-to-government level. This was in part because China was not accustomed to working in Latin America or the Caribbean for that matter, and so found it most convenient to engage with Latin American leaders at the highest levels, presidents and the executive staff. And now that, we see Chinese companies operating much like other international companies do. They are very active at the municipal level, state level, provincial level, striking deals, and indeed this is frequently where the most deals are happening, especially in this sort of tech innovation space. So these are the things that are happening right now. What does this all mean? This means, that there will be some, I think, very welcome opportunities and a lot more deals struck, often at the local level and often in these very specific sectors, these focused, new infrastructure sectors. But it also means that there will be a growing perception of competition on the part of the U.S., of U.S. companies and other international companies that are also operating in this space. And this will lead to, I think, what we see, what Robert has very aptly described as, a sense that both countries are in an all-out battle for sort of tech supremacy at this particular juncture, and will lead to more in the way, I think, of legislation, of decision-making, of the sort, that we saw as related to semiconductors and other limitations on China's ability to grow in certain sectors. So these, I think, this growth, this focusing, this on specific sectors of interest to the U.S. and of tremendous concern to the U.S. is only going to, foment what is an ongoing and contentious situation between the U.S. and China, which has already been described in tremendous detail. I should also point out, though, that not all of these deals are embraced with open arms by everyone in Latin America, right? There are, some points of contention, some things that are very much concerning to some Latin American audiences, and the extent, for example, of Chinese engagement in the hydropower sector and in power generation and electricity distribution in general has been of concern to some segments of the population in certain countries. Chile is one of those examples, where the acquisition of a Spanish company asset in the electricity generation space was largely opposed, and received a lot was the source of a lot of concern by a number of folks that were concerned about China's overall influence in the country because of the trade dynamics, but also the extent to which that country is dependent on Chinese investment in a wide range of sectors. That's just one. Niobium investment, Chinese niobium investment in Brazil is another example, right? And Bolsonaro was very critical of that. We'll see what happens in that sector looking ahead. But a lot of these areas that China's interested in, and that includes, critical minerals, lithium and other things, are going to, they're important. Chinese investment is important in these sectors. China will continue to work with and I think be invited by, wide-ranging delegations at different levels of government to talk about new deals. But these are sectors that are very, very, very contentious, very sensitive, and not just from a U.S. perspective, but also from increasingly a domestic perspective in certain cases. I just want to, on the question of, of ideology, right, and embracing China's approach to governance, it's interesting. There have been a number of new studies that have come out just very recently that, that suggest that while China is a top economic partner and continues to be seen as such, that there's just not that confidence, right, in China's government and China's leadership that perhaps Latin American populations have for the U.S., for example, or other partner nations. And for that reason, and just based on talks, my discussions in Latin America, my sense is that yes, democracy is eroding. This is a very precarious moment. Confidence in governments is eroding, but there doesn't seem to be anyone out there, right, including in those countries that have really embraced China, where we see the most drastic democratic erosion, saying, yeah, let's go ahead and embrace the China model full on. Right? No, there's not really a sense that China China's approach to governance is something that the region wants to adopt in its entirety, perhaps aside from, this maybe on the economic side, a real focus on infrastructure-led growth. But other than that, it's not really something that I see translating, at least at this particular juncture in the Latin American context.
All right, I have one last question for each of you before we open it up to Q&A, and it has to do with one of Solida's prior questions on climate action. As we know, Latin America as a region is not really a big part of the problem globally when it comes to emissions, but it can be a big part of the solution. We talked about critical minerals. The Amazon is, of course, top of mind. How does this fall within the confines of the bilateral, trilateral relationship? Benjamin, do you think U.S. China links can support climate action or hinder climate action in this context?
Yeah, I think the United States has often portrayed China as a bad actor in the Americas when it comes to environmental protection, whether historically because of its investments in the hydrocarbons industry or in coal-fired power production. The reality is that the Chinese are also the leading actor in renewables and green technologies, in investing in the lithium sector and in copper production, which are critical minerals for the electric vehicles industry and the battery industry for storing utility scale renewable energy production. So I think you could conceive of U.S.-China cooperation, the potential for it in the energy transition in the Americas as one way for the United States and China to figure out small areas, some islands of cooperation and collaboration. Instead, it's yet another battleground for competition. In particular, that's true for critical minerals. I think the United States sees the strategic interest in developing electric vehicle and battery production and sees a finite amount of these resources in the Americas, in places like Chile and Peru when it comes to copper, in places like Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile when it comes to lithium. It's more than 60% of the global supply. And it sees much of it being mined by Chinese companies, being brought to China, which dominates the global battery industry. And so the same is true across the board for wind, solar, green hydrogen. So this is yet another battleground for great power competition. In this case, I think it's to the benefit of the energy transition and of Latin America. You have two major economic powers competing to invest in new technologies, above all in the production of critical minerals and innovations such as green hydrogen. So I don't see it in this case as undermining the energy transition in the Americas, undermining the role that the Americas could play in conserving the Amazon or taking advantage of the wind in Patagonia, of the solar production in the Atacama Desert in Chile, or accelerating the production of the minerals needed. But I don't see it as an area for U.S.-China cooperation.
Excellent. Margaret?
Yeah, it's a great question. I agree entirely with Benjamin's assessment of China's overall performance in this space. It's very difficult to tell. On the one hand, you have China investing in sectors that, historically speaking, are very impactful from an environmental perspective and climate perspective. On the other, you have China being a primary contributor to green energy, to this transition in a lot of countries in the Latin American and Caribbean regions. I suppose, rather than collaboration, the competition, might generate some opportunities for the region to be more active in some of these spaces. We just saw during the North American Leaders Summit, some talk of Mexico being more involved in the manufacturing of higher end manufacturing of semiconductors and involved in green hydrogen and also in critical minerals. And so there is, I think some opportunity. Of course, so much depends there on Mexican capacity to make that happen. So there may be a long road ahead. What I would say, and just as a final point on this particular issue, China views climate cooperation, very differently from some other partners in this space, and this is especially true in the Caribbean. When you hear China talk about collaboration on climate change in the Caribbean, they typically talk about infrastructure investment, right? Viewing infrastructure as critical to resilience, to adaptation especially in these small island nations where they're being hit by storms all of the time, and infrastructure is just absolutely decimated. And the Caribbean very much adopts this view. It's been championed by CARICOM and by a number of very prominent leaders in that sub-region. And so, to the extent that this is a big part of China's model, right, and is not of that of other countries, other, partner nations operating in these spaces, there is a degree of complementarity, right? It's true that infrastructure needs to be there and continue to be there in some form if these countries are going to continue to operate in a functional way. Whether that happens or not depends obviously on the political climate and political appetite, and that does not unfortunately appear to be available, to be the context at this juncture.
Very good. Why don't we open it up to questions?
Thanks. We've read a lot and heard a lot about onshoring and reshoring. How significant is this with regard to U.S. China trade? And part B, how significant an opportunity is it for Mexico in particular?
Yeah, I think there is a demand for U.S. multinational corporations to diversify their supply chains. Some of it is based on traumas during the pandemic and interruptions in global shipping and increases in the cost of containers, to have the operations closer to home and closer to the large U.S. market. I think there's also the traumas from the sanctions on Russia and the speed with which companies that had a presence there had to scramble and figure out other opportunities for the supply chain. So I think both those factors, the sort of prospect of China ending up heavily sanctioned in the way that Russia is today, and the idea of reducing the carbon footprint of shipping, the cost of shipping, and the complexities and potential interruptions, have companies newly looking at Latin America who might not have been there, or companies in Mexico thinking of increasing operations. So I think the trend is real. I don't think it's just aspirational, and I think there is already evidence that companies are expanding their presence or newly considering markets. What I would say about it is two things. One is I do think because there's interest, there is opportunity. I do think there's evidence that it's occurring, and I do think it even goes beyond the convenience of geography. Sometimes people talk about a concept of friendshoring, which is to say that they're looking for places to bring their operations that share certain democratic values, the protection of human rights and the environment, where there's not as much reputational risk. So if you're looking to build an electric vehicle and you want to point to your progressive clients and say that every component of it was produced with sustainability in mind, it might be easier to do that in Chile than in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. And so for all of those reasons, I think it is real and it is a good prospect. I do think, not to dampen enthusiasm over what is one sort of sliver of optimism for the Latin American economy, that the investment climate is really challenging. Lack of predictability, lack of confidence in rule of law institutions, the ups and downs of economies throughout the region that make it a very difficult climate for companies to come, and then also inadequate infrastructure, not just in the Caribbean, but companies will want to come and be assured of adequate supplies of energy, things as basic as that, and in particular renewable energies that simply aren't there. And so when the U.S. considers this, it also looks in priority regions that are creating a lot of migration and tries to talk about nearshoring, not just in Mexico, for example, but in Central America and the Caribbean. These are the places where it's hardest to make the case to companies, given insecurity that makes it difficult for executives to operate there, and given the massive amounts of corruption and all the regulatory risk that presents. And so the sort of priorities from the U.S. perspective of where nearshoring might be channeled are the most challenging environments to make the case for private sector interests who aren't doing it for geostrategic purposes, but are doing it for corporate interests.
Any thoughts, Margaret?
No, I mean, just in terms of the sort of effect on U.S.-China trade, there's already been some degree of reshoring, or shoring to other countries, right, of a diversification of supply chains out of China. and specifically, to Vietnam in many cases, or Bangladesh or elsewhere. And with that in mind, we have seen some effects on trade with China, and a real uptick in imports from other nations of specific goods. On the other hand, there has also been a pretty expansive increase in imports of other goods from China. So it just kind of depends on what we're talking about importing. It strikes me now that, when Latin American countries, whether it's Mexico or Central America or any of the others that are, that have been in these discussions with the U.S. and in talks about, possible preferential financing from Exim Bank or other institutions, the competitors really are some other countries, right? Right now, it's not China necessarily; it's Vietnam, it's Bangladesh, it's other places. So.
I would just add, we've looked into this, and interest in nearshoring, friendshoring by U.S. European corporations is real and widespread. Latin America is capturing part of this benefits, particularly in certain industries and in certain geographies. The north of Mexico comes to mind as number one. That said, it takes two to tango, and Latin America is doing little to nothing to attract those investments, right? If I were in any policy position, I would create a nearshoring section of government and send folks to Washington, D.C. to just convince everybody to send money home, because it's just such low-hanging fruit. None of this is happening. If anything, quite the opposite. So I think benefits are going to continue to accrue, but the opportunity cost is so high, right? We should be getting orders of magnitude more investment in the region relative to what could have been. We'll take one final question over here.
Good morning, all. Thank you for such an interesting conversation. Benjamin, I wanted to return to the point that you made about the evolution of U.S. government policy and thinking vis-a-vis China and the region. The question's for both of you, of course, but just to piggyback off of that, do you see any indications beyond the adherence of, under certain conditions, Chinese engagement and investment can be a positive for the Americas? Do you see any prospects for an evolution in Washington for a more comprehensive strategy? Comprehensive in any sense, really, of the word. And the reason why I ask is there are a couple of little pieces out there. It doesn't strike me as a comprehensive strategy, but maybe I'm missing something living here in New York. You've alluded to some of it already in the nearshoring discussion, right? There's some potential. Perhaps it's more talk right now than substance, not only because of Washington, but to your point on, sort of local capacity and prioritization. There's some other initiatives out there, too. Secretary Blinken, in the run-up to the Summit of the Americas, talked about working with Congress and others to create new rules for the types of investment that the United States government could make, whether because of migratory issues, sustainability issues, bump that up to middle-income and high middle-income countries. That could be a game changer in South America. There are also some efforts underway in Washington, whether in Congress or the executive, to open up the spigot, so to speak, in terms of climate finance. That could be a new mechanism by which Washington invests directly in the region. These are just a couple of examples, but I'm just curious, based on your sense and your day in and day out, I think you guys covered well what the various strands of thinking have been, including what was a bit of a drastic, whether on the merits or not, a drastic change for a bit of time in the Trump administration that's been reined back. Where do we go from here? Thank you.
Maybe we start with Benjamin and we give Margaret the last word.
Sure. I think that the need for strategic thinking has been met to some degree. I know many are unsatisfied with the outcomes. I think the United States, broadly speaking, and in bipartisan fashion, acknowledges that China has gained tremendous influence economically and politically in the Americas, and that's not in the U.S. interest, and that there's competition in sectors that are of strategic importance to the United States. Minerals are one of them. There's recognition of that as well. There's also recognition that the United States can no longer rely on the values argument. I think for a while there was a sense that that the values mismatch between largely democratic Latin America and authoritarian China, the historical connections, the people-to-people ties, that all this would be sufficient. I think those things still exist, as Margaret points out, but they're not enough in infrastructure-starved region. And so it's very difficult for the United States to discourage relationships between Latin American governments and China by arguing historical people ties, historical connections, or shared values. And I think it's clear that Latin America itself is not going to take sides in great power competition, and the United States now understands that. The idea of insisting upon a decoupling is a non-starter in almost all of the region, and I think there's broad awareness of that as well. I do think there's even a rhetorical change in the way that Secretary Blinken and others talk about the defense of democracy, which is that democracy must deliver now. The recognition that even what's in common, which we think of as this democratic pillar of our relationship in the Western Hemisphere, is not enough either. And that Latin Americans have suffered sufficiently that you now need to make sure democracy delivers, which is to say shared prosperity, addressing inequality. The values themselves, those shared principles, are no longer a ballast for the U.S. relationship in the Americas. So I think the strategic shift has taken place. What we have not seen are resources. And that's a major gap in U.S. policy in the region. I don't consider it a strategic problem, but I consider it in terms of our understanding of what needs to be done. But if we're not going to invest more in infrastructure, in whether it's in renewables development, in critical minerals, in nearshoring infrastructure so that Latin America can take advantage of the opportunity, then really it's irrelevant, all those realizations that I listed. Right? The fact that the United States recognizes the threat from China in the Americas and recognizes that the United States is not doing enough is rather meaningless unless the United States then takes the next step and says that there'll be serious resources made available. And those resources could be available, right? I think sometimes we think of the United States as having real structural disadvantages. China has state-owned enterprises that it can direct, and the United States can't do that. Or China has the Belt and Road Initiative. If you look at the resources marshaled for Ukraine, correctly in my view, you see that when the United States decides there's a strategic priority in the world, it can marshal enormous, almost incomprehensible resources to address it. And the United States, for a variety of reasons, has not made that policy judgment, neither in Congress nor in the budgets that we see from the White House. And so what I would say is the strategic thinking has been done and come to what I think is a sensible conclusion, but without resources, the United States is not really competing in great power competition.
I mean, I have very little to add to that aside from, perhaps noting that there has been a recognition. There are initiatives. I think there were a few things that were mentioned also at the Summit of the Americas, right, that are looking to sort of consolidate all of the work that's being done under a singular umbrella. But there's also a recognition of maybe what has not worked, at least to some degree, right? This sort of the beating of the battle drum on 5G, talking about the extent to which that Chinese 5G equipment poses a threat to national security simply does not resonate in Latin America, as Latin American governments look to simply be able to access technologies at a lower cost. The same, I think, goes for, there are a lot of other, I think, messages that have fallen really on deaf ears in Latin America, including as concerns debt trap diplomacy and a lot of these other sort of debt-related narratives. And those, we've seen not really be used with much frequency anymore, especially at the highest levels of U.S. government. So, I mean, there is, and I think this is an evolving thing, and we do see real efforts to sort of change course with those things in mind. That said, I do believe that so much of what we're doing in Latin America is still motivated by China. That Latin America policy is still very much a China policy in many ways. And so until it becomes a Latin America policy in its own right, recognizing the value of U.S. engagement with Latin America and the longstanding economic and political partnerships and other ties that can be brought to bear, I think it will resources at least will continue to be misdirected. And that includes, I think, there's a lot happening that's outside of the economic realm. For example, efforts to build capacity within the State Department to build capacity in countries to be able to negotiate more effectively with China. That's great, but that again is sort of a very much China-driven initiative as opposed to an effort to engage with the region for U.S. the sake of of broader U.S. Latin America relations. So.
Margaret, Benjamin, thank you so much for your comments. Thank you more broadly to all our friends at the Wilson Center, the audience today, We really appreciate your questions, your attendance, and with this, we'll close the event. Thank you for coming.